Welcome to the Arizona Civics Podcast, where we focus on strengthening civic education in Arizona. Our mission is to support educators, engage with experts, and connect with community leaders to enhance civics for students across the state. We're excited to have you tune into the podcast as we elevate civics for educators and students in the Grand Canyon State. Along the way, we'll be joined by some longtime colleagues and friends, along with some new friends who share our passion for civics and Arizona. I'm your host, Liz Evans, Program Director for Civic Education and Outreach at Arizona State University's Center for American Civics. Let's work together to make a difference and inspire the next generation of citizens. Happy Constitution Day, everyone. I feel like at this point, this is just our resident scholar author, because this is now, your fourth time on the podcast, Dr. Porwancher. It is, I learned so much from you. I mean, I get to work with you, and then we get to have these talks, and I'm really interested to talk about this book because the writing of it is a little different than the ones we have talked about. So Dr. Porwancher, can you tell us a little bit about this book and kind of about how the authorship came to be?
To be sure. Well, it's always a pleasure to be on the pod. It's great to work with you, and it's great to be able to have these conversations and share them with your audience. So I really appreciate getting to come back on with some regularity. And I'm especially excited to talk about this project, partly because it speaks to my interest in students and mentorship. This project originally started when I was at the University of Oklahoma, where I spent the first 12 years of my faculty life before I was fortunate to come here to Arizona State University. And, like ASU, Oklahoma is a large state university, not nearly as big as ASU, but a large state university with a lot of really high-performing students. And, we're fortunate at places like ASU and Oklahoma to get students who could go anywhere, and they choose, because of scholarship money, proximity to home, because of particular strengths in certain programs that a large university might have, come to these institutions. And so when you're a professor at a place like Oklahoma or ASU, you quickly learn that your best undergrads are as good as the students you can find anywhere in the country. And I was so impressed with the high caliber of the students at Oklahoma. And I had thought that with guidance, they would be capable of producing publishable work that could survive the scrutiny of peer review on academic topics. And I decided to test that theory. And I asked three of my best students. One of them went on to Yale Law. One of them went on to University of Cambridge for grad school. And another became the first Luce Scholar from Oklahoma in a decade. And I asked them to join me on a book project, not as research assistants, but as full-fledged co-authors. And the subject of the book was the life and legacy of a 19th century legal figure named James Bradley Thayer, who was a professor at Harvard Law, and he exercised profound influence over his proteges, over the students there who would go on to become leading figures on the bench, on the Supreme Court, in legal academia. And so it was a book by a professor and his former students, about a professor and his former students, perhaps too on the nose, but we proceeded apace regardless. And it was really a rewarding exercise for me to get to work with these really sharp young people and teach them the craft of producing historical scholarship. So the project was a blast to work on, and I'm really glad that we have a book to show for it.
And it's such a cool thing that, again, they're not research assistants. They are authors on this. And I think that just speaks to who you are too. But I know as a grad student right now, that's a really big deal. So we're talking about James Bradley Thayer and his mentorship and his teaching. So how did his mentorship and teaching shape the careers of his students and kind of ultimately American legal thought? Can you share some examples of how his influence is seen in modern law?
Sure. Thayer's influence in modern law, I think, is pervasive but discreet in many ways, because he didn't sit on the bench, which affords high visibility and concrete power. And he wasn't terribly well published. He was always sacrificing his time publishing towards helping other scholars with their publishing, and even more so towards preparing for class, toward investing in students. And so his impact, you're not going to find it in, canonical legal treatises. You're not going to find it in judicial opinions that he wrote. He never donned judicial robes. Where you have to find it is in the archive, in the personal correspondence, in the marginalia of the student textbooks of the future judges that he taught. And that is where you see this profound impact that Thayer had. He was beloved as a professor, and the word beloved really doesn't do it justice. He was revered as almost a quasi religious figure. The book is called The Prophet of Harvard Law, James Bradley Thayer and His Legal Legacy, because his students would use the word prophet to describe him. One of them described an article he wrote as his alpha and omega. And so you often see, another one described uh, Thayer as his father confessor, and this student described himself as a, quote, disciple. And so they are constantly referring to him in this overtly religious language. They saw him as more than just a mentor. He's almost this quasi-religious figure, this demigod handing down revealed truth. Such was the depth of reverence that they had for James Bradley Thayer. And the particular philosophy of law that they internalized is known as legal realism. What Thayer taught was that the law is far too complex and indeterminate and rife with incongruity to be characterized with facile legal principles that can be applied syllogistically. Thayer rejected the idea that you can treat legal cases almost like a geometric proof. The world was just far too messy for that kind of facile approach. And so in legal realist fashion, he taught that, yes, there are legal principles, but they are flexible guidelines that have to accommodate unforeseen exigencies. He stressed that the law is a human creation that can be subject to fallibility and may need correction through the democratic process. And most of all, he emphasized the importance of judicial restraint. For Thayer, the paramount principle of a democracy was self-government. The highest expression of democracy was the people, through their elected legislatures, passing laws that govern their lives and their liberties. And he thought that unelected judges should be very wary of voiding legislation passed by the people's representatives, except in rare cases where it is beyond rational question that the law is unconstitutional. His view is that the question before a judge when considering the constitutionality of a statute was not whether the judge thought it comported with the Constitution, but whether any judge rationally could. And so there was a really low bar that legislators had to meet because they were accountable to the voters in ways that judges were not. And that lesson about the import of judicial restraint was the core lesson that so many of his proteges internalized and then applied themselves when they assumed their privileged perches on the Supreme Court and other influential courts.
So you talked about judicial restraint, right? What's another side of that? Are there theories out there that the court should be changing laws? Because I know judicial restraint is, just like you said, under very few circumstances should that be. What is kind of I don't want to say opposite, but I don't know what the word I'm looking for is.
Sure. I mean, there are people who would advocate let me put it this way. I think you could find people suggesting that judges should enjoy more latitude than Thayer would have, that you should have a degree of judicial activism from the bench. One of the criticisms of Thayer's ideas in his own day was that if the bench is overly deferential to lawmakers in all instances, you could have a situation where you have a tyranny of the majority, where democratic majorities pass laws that encroach on the fundamental liberties of minorities. And, there is this fundamental tension in American democracy. And I always talk about this in my constitutional history classes with students. We have, on the one hand, this paramount principle of majority rule that's central to democracy, but we also have these counter-majoritarian liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, your right to due process in a criminal trial. That, the list goes on in the Bill of Rights. And these rights are not subject to the whims of legislative majorities. And Thayer's ideas were critiqued because some people felt that you do want a more activist judiciary when it comes to safeguarding individual liberties. Now, again, Thayer didn't publish very much, and his key contribution to his theory of judicial restraint consisted really of one relatively short law review article. And it would ultimately be up to later generations to refine his ideas and figure out how to advance Thayerian ideals of restraint, but also try to reconcile them with the notion that the judiciary might have a special role to play in safeguarding individual rights.
Think civics is boring? Think again. Civics in a Year is the podcast that answers 250 questions about how American government actually works. No textbook required. Each episode is about 10 minutes. Fast, smart, surprisingly fun. Perfect for your commute, your coffee break, or when you're avoiding emails. Search Civics in a Year wherever you get your podcast, or head to civicsinAyear.buzzsprout.com. Go ahead, get smarter in 10 minutes.
So you talked about how Thayer was, known for working closely with his students and maintaining kind of this active correspondence. Do we know what teaching methods or mentorship practices he employed to make him so inspiring and such an effective teacher?
Well, Thayer stressed a few things. One was the importance of balance. So he would tell students, don't work yourself to death. You should have intervals of sound sleep, of rest, of relaxation, of sociability, and you should apply your efforts diligently. And so there are some students, you can imagine an incoming cohort at Harvard Law, probably still today, might benefit from a kind of Thayerian admonition about work-life balance. Some students don't need as much encouragement on the life part as others, I have found. But some do. He also, his pedagogy changed over time. And so initially he leaned more into legal treatises, but over time he became a fan of what became known as the case method of instruction that is still used today in law school. It was really being pioneered by the dean of Harvard Law at the time that Thayer was sitting on the faculty in the latter quarter of the 19th century. And there you're reading cases and you are inferring principles from the raw material of the case law instead of just reading a scholarly commentary about what cases say. And so it's a much more active, participatory form of legal education, and it rests on the Socratic method, on the professor interrogating the students. Now, Thayer would lecture, but over time we see him lean more into a Q&A style that has become a staple for us here at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. We pride ourselves on our Socratic seminars, as you well know. So students really, appreciated that approach. And then there was those ineffable, intangible, interpersonal qualities of his. He had a warmth, a generosity of spirit and an intellectual honesty that the students found themselves drawn to. And student after student who would, praise the faculty at large always singled Thayer as the first among equals. Louis Brandeis, the future Supreme Court justice, described Thayer as his, quote, best friend on the faculty when he was at Harvard Law. And so there is this deep personal connection that he develops with these students that earned earned him their affection.
So kind of on that same topic then, this book is a joint effort with you and former students. What do you see as the benefits and challenges of co-authoring such kind of this important historical work with your students? And how do you feel like this process kind of reflected Thayer's own style of mentorship?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll leave it to my co-authors, perhaps in other venues, to decide whether I'm Thayerian or not. But I think that part of the challenge is, and I'm really sympathetic to my co-authors, Jake, Austin, and Taylor, who are so sharp at throwing anybody into the intricacies of 19th century law when none of these people had, gone to law school. Yeah, only one of them actually ended up going to law school. That was challenging. Another challenge that they may not have expected was just reading the handwriting. It takes a long time to decipher some of the handwriting from these 19th century figures. And also, there's a big difference between producing a paper that's going to get an A+ with a star as an undergrad and producing something that is going to survive the rigors of peer review at a university press. And getting, all of these students had gotten feedback from me on papers, but they had gotten feedback from me as a professor giving feedback to a student. And now, for the first time in the process of working on this book, they were getting feedback from me as a colleague, giving them the kind of constructive criticism that they needed to ensure that this book could actually get a book deal and find its way into its covers. There was also the challenge of, I think, psychologically preparing them for the peer review process. Peer review can be brutal, and I think unnecessarily so. I'm a big believer that peer review can have a lot of benefit. This is the process for those listeners who may be less familiar with academia, wherein a book manuscript or a journal article is sent out to experts in the field. And with books, it's usually single blind. So the reviewers, these professors at other universities who have subject matter expertise in whatever your book is about, they will know who you are, but you will not know who they are unless they choose to reveal themselves, which sometimes they do, but often they don't. And that anonymity can sometimes give rise to criticism that is unhelpfully harsh. And, at this point, I've been doing this job for a while. I'm dating myself here, but I've been a professor for 15 years, and I've gotten enough harsh peer review that you become a little bit numb to it, and you just try to figure out, okay, what can I pull out of this that's constructive, and you put your ego to the side. But for a first-time scholar getting peer review for the first time and seeing their work ripped apart uncharitably can be, it can really rock you. And so I, talked through with my co-authors when we would get peer review, here's why this criticism was unfair to you, or here's something that could be valuable that we could apply. Or here's a comment that you shouldn't give too much credence to, or here's a criticism and here's a way that we can adapt it, because maybe this criticism we think is unfair, but maybe it was made in good faith, and it means that we didn't do a good enough job of articulating our point here, and we need to clarify our language. And so I tried to give them a boost in terms of validating that, what you've done is worthwhile, and this is the nature of peer review, and you can take it in stride. And what one of my student co-authors said to me, I'm really glad the first time I'm going through this process is with you. And so all of that were unique challenges that, I wouldn't have otherwise in working on a book on my own. And then part of it was also, this is the first time I had co-authored a book. And all of my other books are solo enterprises, which is more common in the humanities. And so trying to impose on the book a coherence of voice was another challenge. And that's where I needed to come in as the kind of superintending force to make sure that all of these different chapters fit together thematically and that there was some kind of consistency in the prose and the style to give the book a kind of single authorial voice. So it was definitely a unique challenge and one of the more rewarding ones I've done in my career.
I think that accepting any kind of criticism on writing, like that's a life skill, right? And how beneficial for your students to, again, go through that, because it's not a fun process. But you get used to it and you start to just figure out what's going to be helpful and what can I just put in my back pocket. So I think I wish I had gone through my first peer review process with a mentor, with a professor, because how valuable is that now for those students? So why do you think that Thayer's stories and contributions are still relevant today, especially if we're looking at, students who are interested in legal history or education or the shaping of American law and rights?
Yeah, I think he's hugely relevant. When you think about the law in terms of these networks of intellectual patronage, in terms of intergenerational mentorship, you had somebody like, Felix Frankfurter, who revered Brandeis, and Brandeis had studied at Thayer's feet. Frankfurter has been cited by the likes of our current Chief Justice as a kind of, legal lodestar in some of his own thinking about judicial restraint. And so when you look at a case like, it was a big deal at the time, a lot's happened in American history since, the early aughts, but the Affordable Care Act case, whether the Supreme Court was going to strike that down or not, that was the big question at the time. And John Roberts, who writes the majority opinion in that case, says it is not the role of this court to save the American people from their political choices. Meaning, if Americans elected Congress and Congress passed the Affordable Care Act and the people don't like that, then they need to send new representatives to repeal the law. And so, regardless of, whether any given listener likes that piece of legislation or not, I think the point stands that what Roberts wrote was Thayerism par excellence. And that's coming from a Chief Justice who's looking to Frankfurter, who's looking to Brandeis, who's looking to Thayer. Roberts was only 3 steps removed from James Bradley Thayer. I mean, it's a reminder of just how recent Thayer is in history, even if it feels a little distant to us because it's out of living memory. It's really just a couple degrees of separation. The question of judicial restraint and the proper relationship between Congress and the Supreme Court is a perennial one. And what's interesting about Thayer is that he advances this idea of judicial restraint as part of a legal philosophy for the ages. He is not an instrumentalist in the sense that he is not trying to use this judicial philosophy to arrive at some sort of predetermined political outcome that he wants to see from the courts. In the immediate wake of his death, at a time when legislatures, state and national, were doing more progressive things and the judiciary was more conservative, you see the progressives become champions of Thayerism. But that flip-flops after World War II, where you have a more progressive Supreme Court, the Warren Court, and then you have conservatives saying, no, we need judicial restraint. And now we're in this really interesting moment where conservatives have been talking about the importance of judicial restraint for a long time. And conservatives are now have a dominant majority on the Supreme Court like they haven't had for a very long time. And it is interesting to see some conservative legal scholars advanced a different view than judicial restraint, what's sometimes known as common good constitutionalism. And there are people on the left who came of age in the wake of the Warren Court and had really internalized this idea that you want an activist judiciary to safeguard people's rights. And all of a sudden, I think they're starting to flirt with a version of judicial restraint that they would have been less enamored of, a couple decades ago. And so it is interesting to see the ways that Thayerism can become popular among people on the left or people on the right, depending on the contingencies of the moment. And part of what my students and I wanted to do in this book is both rescue him from the vicissitudes of these political debates and show that there is a principled approach to law that can transcend the transient, political divisions of any given moment, and yet at the same time show how his ideas can continue to have modern relevance. And as long as people are debating whether judges should be exercising more power or less, Thayer is going to be relevant. And I suspect that is a debate that will endure as long as this republic.
So I think my last question then is, there's so many people in history to write about, right? What is it that personally for you drew you to Thayer's story specifically? And, for our listeners, what lessons do you want them to kind of take away from this, whether it's about mentorship, legal scholarship, evolution of, legal education? What do you want our listeners to kind of walk away with?
Well, I was drawn to this book because I had originally written my dissertation when I was in grad school about one of Thayer's proteges, who was named John Henry Wigmore. He became the dean at Northwestern Law, and he became the dominant figure in shaping evidence law, the law that governs how jury trials are conducted. And I was always really interested in jury trials because I think they're really fascinating, and they're also windows into how a society thinks about the distinction between truth and falsehood, which is always relevant, even today, especially today.
Yes.
So I had come to Thayer by way of this fellow Wigmore. And in reading about legal history this time period, it turned out that one major figure after the next, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louis Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter, Learned Hand, who's the most famous judge in American history to have never sat on the U.S. Supreme Court. All of these people hero worship this one guy, James Bradley Thayer, and yet no one had ever done a book on him. And so I've been sitting around waiting for the book that would uncover the godfather of modern American law and limn his profound influence on the future judges and legal scholars who would shape American law as we still know it today. And I realized after a decade plus that if I didn't do this book myself, I might be waiting the rest of my career and it might never appear. And I was having lunch with one of these students who would become a co-author of mine. And I said, do you think I could ever write a book that's co-authored with students as part of a collective enterprise? He's like, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. I don't know if he realized I was about to rope him in the following day with an email being like, well, what about you and your friends? So, all these students know each other. They're all good friends. So that's how it really got started. And I think in terms of what I hope people can take away from the book, it is that we so often look to footnotes in judicial opinions to think about influence. We have this system of stare decisis, right? Which means let the decision stand, wherein one case cites another case that cites another case, and you get this lineage of cases, and they're supposed to be coherent, and yes, the law shifts, but sort of slowly over time. And it is important to look at cases. I assign a lot of cases in my classes. I write about cases in the Thayer book and in my other scholarship. But if we only look at cases, we are missing so much of the story of how American law changes. The law is fundamentally a human endeavor. And the people who are wearing these gowns and sitting on the bench and handing down opinions were once young folks in their formative years, nervously taking notes in a Harvard Law School classroom. And we have to understand them at that formative moment in their life if we are to make sense of the momentous opinions that they would hand down decades later that govern our lives and our liberties today. And so my ambition is that people will walk away from this book realizing that behind our legal doctrine are deeply personal stories about human beings with all of their potential, with all of their fallibility, and they're bid to form connections with one another. And it's not the sort of thing, I'll be candid, that you're going to learn a lot about in a typical law school classroom, but I'm a historian, not a lawyer. And so I get to get away with writing books like this. And so it's really been a privilege to get to work with these really bright, young, aspiring scholars on a book like this. And it's a privilege to get to chat with you and talk to your listeners and your audience about it.
Well, and I think when we think about Constitution Day, people think about when the Constitution was signed. And I love that we've decided to kind of, because I think that's something that connects you and I. We love history. We love the stories behind it. And we get to celebrate this Constitution Day with a story about the Constitution and about the application of law. And I love that this is about mentorship, and it's about, Thayer working with students and you working with students, because education is something that connects us. So Dr. Porwancher, I mean, we should just start our own series at this point, because it's so fun to chat with you. Thank you so much. And again, for our listeners, the book is called The Prophet of Harvard Law, James Bradley Thayer and His Legal Legacy. Dr. Porwancher, you're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Arizona Civics Podcast. We're so glad you joined us. Before you go, don't forget to follow us on social media to stay connected and get updates on upcoming episodes, resources, and more. You can find us on all social media platforms at ASU Civics. And make sure to sign up for our newsletter for exclusive content, event announcements, and tools to help bring civics to life in your classroom and community. Visit civics.asu.edu to subscribe. Until next time, let's keep working together to inspire educators, students, and communities to make a difference. See you soon.